Welcome to the History Nerd Night podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Nathalia Holt and her book. All right, well, hold on. Before I even say it, this one's a bit hard to sell. I don't know how Nathalia got this thing made. It's about the Roosevelt brothers. It's called The Beast in the Clouds, and they're on the hunt for Panda. They're hunting Panda. Trust me, I know you're horrified. We deal with that. We do. I promise we're not going to be excited about it. Trust me, it's still a great story. Was so happy to talk to Nat. How about I shut up? Let's get to this horrifying idea. And here we are with author Nathalia Holt, The Beast in the Clouds, the Roosevelt brothers' deadly quest to find the mythical giant panda. Nat, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about this book.
I love to style myself as just a huge history nerd. This story I had never heard of anywhere. Hadn't seen it mentioned. When did you first hear about the story and decide, oh, this is a book?
It's a story that hasn't been written about before, and I came across it in an unusual way. It was while I was researching my last book, which is about the origins of the CIA. And I was looking into Kermit Roosevelt Jr., who was a CIA station chief in the Middle East. And the problem when you are researching the Roosevelts is that they all seem to have the same name. They're all Theodore or Kermit or Quentin, and it just repeats over the generations. And so I was trying to parse out Kermit Roosevelt Jr. from Kermit Roosevelt Sr., both of whom served in World War II. And as I was doing that, I learned about this expedition that Kermit Roosevelt Sr. had taken in the 1920s. And to me, this expedition just seemed crazy because they were searching for the last large mammal unknown to science. And this was the panda. At this time, you have every bear is known to science, even the polar bear. But Westerners had not yet described the panda. And there were many people, even scientists, who believed that the bear was just a myth and it did not exist. And during the 1920s, you had dozens of expeditions going out to find the panda, and they all came up empty-handed until the Roosevelts.
Now, in doing your research, did you go to a zoo to see a panda by yourself? Did you try and hug the panda? Because I would totally hug the panda. I would love to say that I'm just, a big, strong guy, but I see a panda, I can't help but want to hug it.
I would love to hug a panda. Nothing would make me happier. No, unfortunately, I didn't get a chance for that. It's probably frowned upon, is my guess. But I did get to interview many scientists. And I have to say that I've interviewed a lot of scientists in my career. I have interviewed physicists and gene therapists and molecular biologists and all kinds of different people. But I think that the mammalogists that study pandas might be the happiest people I have ever spoken with. They were just upbeat, very generous with their time, seem to love talking about pandas. I think it might be one of those jobs that you get and you're just happy.
I think anybody who listens to this episode is probably thinking, I'm going to Google how to be a panda scientist. That's right up there with beer taster. How could you have a bad day doing that?
Yeah, just a dream job.
What I really like about this book, especially the way you approach it, is there's lots of ways to go about telling these stories, right? And especially the Roosevelt family. You could do a lot of backstory, but what I really love is you've written a very streamlined book. You drop right into this story and this journey. Was that something you looked at and you said, hey, I want to get right to the action? Did you think hey, everybody will get confused if I have to name all the Roosevelts because they all sound the same? Was that a choice for you, or is this how the story went?
It was a difficult journey, actually, to get that opening down, because originally I had written a much longer book that had all of the opening of them starting the expedition. It had them going to Europe and getting supplies and doing all this fun supply shopping. And I wrote a lot about one of the expedition members, Jack Young, and his training at the Field Museum in Chicago. So there's this whole section of the book that I ended up cutting. And that was really thanks to my editor, who I kept saying, I would love for this to start on the trail, but I'm just having the hardest time. And he was like, just cut the first 3 chapters. It made it seem so simple. That took quite a lot of work to make that happen. But it is exciting because then you start right in the middle of the action with everyone on the trail.
But I don't want to skate over it. That is difficult to make sure that people still feel connected to the characters when you take out a lot of that kind of introduction. And, other authors that I've talked to, this reads to be one of my favorites, Buddy Levy, who writes books kind of this nature. He's also very good like you are, where it's like, hey, let's just get to the story. Let somebody get involved in the story, and they're going to make those connections, and kind of trusting that what you're going to give people is going to make them say, man, I'd be pretty upset to be stuck on this mountain too.
Yeah, it's always hard to cut parts of the book like that. But I think in the end, it does get you into the story sooner, and you still feel connected with the characters and what they're going through.
Well, let's start with the first two, the named ones, the Roosevelt brothers. Who are they? What are kind of their personalities at this point when they're starting out the journey?
When I first learned about the Roosevelt brothers, I sort of assumed that they would just be like any privileged men of the era. I mean, these are the sons of President Theodore Roosevelt. But they turned out to not be as I expected at all. These are very sensitive, introspective men that go on a journey. They go on a transformation during this expedition, and they end up becoming very different than the people they started as. And it was just such a privilege to be able to put that story together and go through their writings, go through their interviews, go through their journals, and learn how that happened. At the end of the story, they end up in a completely different place than where you think they're going to be. And I was also surprised with their friendships. They end up having a very close relationship with Tai Jack Young, who is this young Hawaiian-born translator and naturalist brought in on the trip. And that relationship lasts for decades. It goes on for the rest of their lives. It's not at all what you expect of the time, of that era. And it really just shows how thoughtful they were.
I was able to really connect with a person on the expedition who, how do we say this, took his sweet-ass time and was driving the Roosevelts crazy. Can you tell me about this expedition member?
Oh, Dr. Herbert Stevens. Yes, he's special, isn't he? So he is a biologist from England. He is really the best trained scientist on this expedition, but he is a constant troublemaker for the Roosevelts. They are constantly asking him to hurry up. He gets lost right at the beginning of the book. They can't find him on their first day on the trail. I mean, can you even imagine that? Just vanishes. And from there on, it's just one problem after another with poor Herbert. But it was fun in this book because I had all of these accounts of the expedition from the different members. And so it was so interesting to read what Ted thought about what's happening on the trail at the same time that I can read what Herbert is thinking about the exact same events and putting that story together. And yeah, Herbert Stevens just has a really unique perspective on the biology of what they're finding and ends up having just a great story of what he's able to accomplish just by himself under very difficult conditions.
There's an easy way for you to make somebody like Herbert the villain in this, and there really just aren't villains per se within the book. And I really appreciate that you looked on the bright side of all of these men and what they're doing, even poor, slow Herbert, because as you said, he was, the real scientist who has all of this background, and he wasn't necessarily just, decided to walk off on the trail because he was so in love with the science of this, and he wanted to get it right, and he wanted to be as in-depth as he possibly could, right?
He did. He really cared about the science of what they were doing. And for the Roosevelts, this was not just about science. It was also about adventure. It was also about furthering the legacy of their father. There are a lot of emotions wrapped up in what they were accomplishing. And so I think each member of the expedition brought their own strengths. And it was important to me to display them in their human complexity. None of them are heroes. None of them are villains. They say things that to our ears often seem crazy. And then sometimes they say things that just completely surprise us and give us so much faith in humanity.
All right, we got to deal with the elephant in the room, or probably the panda in the room. They want to kill a panda. There's just no other way to say it, and it sounds wrong, and I think you handle this really well, and I want the listeners to hear this. The Roosevelts are conservationists. They actually do love nature, but part of the way they go about it is hunting animals. for somebody who's like, there is just no reason for them to do this. These two people are terrible. I hope they fail. What would you kind of say to somebody who's coming at it from that direction?
Well, honestly, I think it's pretty natural to hope they fail in the beginning. I think it's very normal to feel that way. And my hope is that as you go through the book, some of your mind is changed by the circumstances, because biology at that time was very different. Killing animals in the name of science was just how it was done. Hunting and science were inextricably linked. And we really see that with Theodore Roosevelt's legacy. That is what he taught his sons, and that really was the basis for biology at the time. So scientists that were studying endangered animals would purposefully go out and kill an entire family of them. And their thinking was that nature has already made its choice. These animals are not going to survive. So what we need to do is preserve the knowledge while we can. Before they disappear, we need to document what is happening with these animals. And of course, they didn't have the tools we have today. They couldn't use cameras in the same way. They were not reliable. They didn't have a way to reliably tag and track animals in the environment. And of course, they didn't have genetic tagging or anything like that. They couldn't take those kind of samples. And so killing and dissecting an animal was the way to study evolution at the time. Even Charles Darwin hunted animals. So as crazy as it sounds, this was just part of what being a scientist was at that time. And I find it really interesting to talk about this. I really like discussing this because I think there are things that we do today in science that generations are going to look back and say, oh, what barbarians they were. Can you believe they were trapping animals and clipping off their tails? I mean, these are conversations that are going to happen in the future. That's what makes history great, right? Is to understand how these things come back and how hopefully science keeps getting better as we progress.
And especially, you've already mentioned it. They didn't know that the panda bear actually existed. It was something that was talked about, and even along the trail, for the people who lived around there, they're like, hey, you seen a panda? They're like, what are you talking about, weirdo? So especially in this particular case, the only way to prove it would be to bring one back, and they didn't know what type of bear it was going to be. Like, we love them now, and we know they're fun and just kind of bouncing around, but all they knew about bears at that point were the other big three that would kill you if you tried to bring them home from out of the mountains.
Yes, that's such a great point, is that at that time, people thought that the panda, if they were speculating about it at all, might be a combination of a polar and a black bear that could kill people. I mean, really, their idea of what this animal would be like is so different than what they find. And I think that's what makes this expedition so interesting and so important.
But just to put a pin on this part of it, anybody who kills a panda now should go to jail, and we should slap them at least once. Can we agree on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, all right, cool. We're good. All right, so we have the crew. I think besides the people, the biggest piece of this that I learned so much too is the terrain. This expedition, where does it go through? What kind of weather, what kind of everything is this crew running into as they're just going deeper and deeper into the wilderness?
So the Roosevelts planned this expedition as going 500 miles, but it becomes twice that. They travel 1,000 miles, and they go through humid rainforests and snowy Himalayas. They go through the stark Tibetan plateau and into dense bamboo jungles that are still covered in ice and snow in April and May. They just go through a range of diverse environments. And at the same time, they're traveling through a China that, frankly, it's hard for us to imagine today, because China at that time was this remote collection of people and cultures and languages that were being torn apart by civil war. It was a time when you had the nationalist government and the communist government who were at war in these parts of the country that the Roosevelts are going through. And so they're describing peoples and cultures that just in many places don't even exist anymore. It's an incredible expedition because of that, not just because of the animals they find, but because of the landscape and the people they meet along the way.
It almost gives you whiplash as you're reading it, because you're like, oh, they're in a rainforest. Wait a second, why is there snow? Now there's all of a sudden, oh no, now they're in the rainforest again. And sometimes I even sat there and I'm like, I must have skipped a page or something. You're like, no, this is just everything that they're dealing with. And like a lot of expeditions like this, food, supplies, all of those things are not something you can just, oh, there's berries on this side of the road, we're going to be fine. They nearly starved to death at least a few times, right?
They do. It's a difficult expedition. It's much more difficult than they thought it would be. They have their supplies that are lost in the Himalayas when the mules leave during a blizzard. They have robbers come and attack them. They deal with sickness. They deal with very serious altitude sickness. And of course, one member of the expedition does die. So there's quite a bit that this group is dealing with.
Now, as far as helpers are concerned, I would be remiss not to mention that there's robbers on the road and there's a lot of stuff going on. Can you talk about what kind of protection they had? Specifically, apparently quite a few ladies who are not going to be robbed without a fight. Can you talk a little bit about their protectors on this trip?
Absolutely. So the Roosevelts traveled with a team of mules who carried most of their possessions and all of their equipment for the expedition. And then they also traveled with a team of guides. And you can think of this sort of as the Sherpa people of Nepal. So these were guides who led the way, who knew the routes, who made the camp, who prepared equipment. And half of the expedition's guides were women. And it was so interesting to learn about their role because many of these women would go at the front of the expedition, lead the way, going back and forth on the trail. So they're often traveling twice the distance of the men that I described most of the journey. And they have to deal with some very dangerous situations, including at one point when bandits have hid themselves on the trail and attack them as they're coming through. And they end up dealing with this situation so well. It's really an exciting moment of the book. And it's interesting just to learn about their lives because these are women who were very athletic, very intelligent. They made great money. Some of them came from cultures that practiced polyandry, and so they had several husbands at home. And Ted even describes China as, quote, the land of women's emancipation. He had so much respect for these women because of what they were doing for the expedition. And I really feel that a lot of his expressions and how he talks about them is very much reflected by what he learned from his father. Theodore Roosevelt was an incredible proponent of women. I mean, the things that he wrote and said about women were so far ahead of his time. He does not get nearly enough credit for it.
Agree.
You see those philosophies in his sons.
Well, what's very funny, too, is a book like this brings it out that there's Hollywood cliches that people say, oh, that didn't happen or that didn't happen. And you have, right, bandits on the trail, right? Like you're watching a Hollywood movie, they're like, oh, there'll be bandits sooner or later. And then, oh, these women out front are taking on the bandits and know how to handle them. If you put it in a Hollywood movie like it actually happened, people will be like, that's ridiculous. Who's writing this garbage? But this is history. This is documented. And it's almost hard to believe at times, right?
It is. It's incredible how much these women did. I have so many amazing stories, not all of which made it into the book. But it was great to be able to include that because I feel like many of these kind of expedition stories, which I love, tend to focus just on a few main characters, which makes sense. It's hard in a book like this to include everyone, but it's wonderful when you can get an idea of what it was like for the other members of the expedition and what their experiences were.
All right, so the Roosevelt brothers are hardcore, right? We're talking about what they're dealing with. This is uber masculine guys doing, really hard stuff. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the books that they brought with them and what were their favorites?
So the Roosevelts planned their reading material very carefully. And in fact, a lot of this is included in the part of the book that I cut in the beginning when they're doing their supply shopping in London. You have to remember that paperback copies of books were not available yet. So they had to choose books that they described as, quote, neither too dull nor too heavy. And so the books they chose were Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. I actually have video of them reading on the trail, which is so fun. And I just love picturing them snuggled up in their rucksacks in a blizzard in the Himalayas, enjoying Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy and drawn into that world. It's so fun to think about. And they even mimic some of Jane Austen's language in their journals when they're writing about their experiences, just very lightheartedly. It's fun.
And for the record, I am not talking smack about their choices. I get it. It's such that juxtaposition of this, supposed manly task. And they're like, well, listen, if we're going to sit down for a few minutes, I need to catch up with Jane, see what she's doing.
Yeah, it's completely unexpected. I was not expecting that at all. But I think it makes sense in a way that here you are, you're freezing, you're hungry on a trail. What better way to get out of that world and just release your mind into, the English countryside and wealthy families?
I have personal experience with this. Anybody of my friends who are going to listen to this are going to mock me. But when I was in Iraq in the army, whenever you get downtime, there would be, places you can watch TV, DVDs at that point in time, because I'm very old. And people would be like, what was your favorite thing to watch? Were you watching Band of Brothers? I'm like, no, rom-coms. Like, you need that break. Sweet Home Alabama, fantastic movie. I'll fight anybody who says otherwise. But it is funny how your brain needs that break when there's a lot of stress and everything. And then a book like that is going to just take you someplace else where your mind can almost kind of recuperate from what you're dealing with.
Absolutely. It's a comfort read. It brings you that comfort. And I can see why they chose those books.
Now, Ted has another thing, too. I don't know how to describe it, but he loved shopping, even on the trail. And one particular thing or one particular scenario jumps out at me where you have the Roosevelt brothers, like their father, very well traveled and very often very respectful to the people around them. But Ted loved buying stuff, including stuff that he probably shouldn't be buying, like religious texts that people would be upset about. Can you talk about that one particular story where Ted probably needed to realize, hey, buddy, that's not for sale?
Yes, there's one village they pass through and where they enter a temple and they decide that they want to be able to buy these old dusty books, is how Ted describes it, that nobody reads. And there's a man in there and he sells it to them, even though they're not actually his to sell. And Ted probably should have realized this, but he either doesn't or he doesn't really care. And then later on that evening, they learn from the villagers that no, these books are actually important. They're called treasure texts and they need to be preserved by the village and kept in their place. And there's some bartering that happens back and forth. And ultimately, of course, Ted gives back the books. But it just goes to show how he really saw everything as his to buy. He's constantly trying to buy things on the trail. I mean, even just random bowls from people that he happens to meet on the trail, just constantly loves to shop, goes to all the markets. People are into trinkets when they travel, so it's not so surprising. But it was really funny to read about kind of his obsession with buying things.
And like we talked about, too, it's just very funny that they were so ahead of their time in a lot of ways and very forward thinking, but there was specific blind spots would sometimes kind of come back to haunt them just a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's shocking to think, how would you ever just buy these texts that are precious to the village? How would you ever even think that's okay? And he tries to justify it and say, oh, they're not being read. So it's so ridiculous. But I think that's one thing that I really wanted to include in this book. I didn't want to include only the good things they do and only the wonderful parts of their personality, but all the mistakes they make as well. And they make all kinds of mistakes. They do all kinds of stupid things. And all of that experience is in there.
Is it amazing to you that they survived? Because as well-traveled as they are, as hardcore as they are, as you said, they can get almost obsessive with things, and it almost gets them killed multiple times. Is it almost like you're researching and your brain is almost kind of like, I don't think they're going to make it. Like, I know they make it, but I almost, like when you know the ending to a movie or something and you can kind of just break from it, and you're like, I know how it's going to end, but I almost think like other things could have happened.
Absolutely. There were so many times that they should have died, that they came close to death. It's incredible to me that Ted survived this. I mean, he came very close to dying there. But I'd say juxtaposed with that, is the fact that they keep pushing the trail farther. They keep going into areas that they are told are too dangerous. They're filled with savages. We hear that word a lot in this book. There are many people that tell them, do not go to this part of China. There are savages there that are going to kill you. And what that area is actually like and who the savages are is such an important part of experiencing this book and understanding what this expedition was really like for the Roosevelts.
Nat, I don't know that I am emotionally ready to discuss what happens at the end of the expedition, so I'm actually going to skip to the very, very final part. We won't go into detail, but just when this is all over and the Roosevelts look back at what has happened, what they've gone through, do you think they wish they never went in and went on this expedition? Because they pay a heavy price for it, emotionally, physically. When you looked at the research, do you think they looked back and said, I wish I never had anything to do with this mission?
Oh, that's such an interesting question, because certainly the people they are at the end of the book is so different than the men that started at the beginning. And so I wonder, I think there's probably a part of them that would love to be the Ted and Kermit who started the expedition, so close, so happy. And yet on the other side of that, in some ways, we have to see the price they pay for the expedition they took. And we definitely see that. That is definitely what happens at the end of the story. And that doesn't mean that there's no redemption, because there is. And I think, we see that especially in the way the brothers changed their minds. After this expedition, they don't go on another hunt again. They don't go on another hunting expedition after this. In fact, they really change how they approach wildlife conservation in a radical way. Kermit Roosevelt becomes such a different person, and the causes he chooses to champion and the protections he urges for pandas in particular, it's just inspiring. And yet, at the end of the day, we still see a very heavy price paid, even with that, for their actions.
So I love this book. I do like to ask authors like yourself who I love your stuff. You know that. Do you ever get to read for fun yourself, especially nonfiction? Are there go-to authors for you? Do you have any friends who have books coming out that you want to plug them real quick for the audience?
Absolutely. I read all the time. I love nonfiction. I love fiction. I do want to plug a book that's coming this fall from Darren Lund. It's called Palace of Deception. And it is about the American Museum of Natural History and Roy Chapman. And it's such a fascinating history. It goes places that you do not expect. And it really shows the underbelly of the American Museum of Natural History from an author who is uniquely positioned to reveal it because he's worked at that museum for so long. It's just a fantastic book. The writing is great. I can't recommend it highly enough. I think you would really like it.
Oh, I've already typed it down. That's happening. No reason. Say less, Nat. Say less. Well, listen, I have one more question for you. There are some poor misguided souls who think nonfiction is boring, right? And if one of those people got sat in front of you and they said, Nat, why should I read The Beast in the Clouds? Nonfiction's not for me. It's boring. What would you say?
The best history transcends time and place. And it's not about the past. It is about the present. It's about the future. And that's really what I try to do in my writing. I want the story to be relevant to people now and to the future of how we see ourselves. I want it to really reveal something about humanity. And for me, that's the best history books do that.
Nat, couldn't agree more. Absolutely love this book. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about it.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
And that's it for this episode. Nathalia, thank you so much for coming on The Beast in the Clouds. I know it sounds horrible, but trust me, the book is amazing. The story is awesome. Nat killed it again. All of her books are great. Go out and get them. In the meantime, hit us up Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.